Night, mostly cloudy. Lows in the mid-30s. Sunday, a slight chance of rain showers in the morning.
Days 4, we're dropping down to days, party 4. Days 4, main days, party 4 dropping. Is there anyone in the area?
Hey everyone, welcome back to Backcountry Amateur Radio. This is Eric, KI7WJP, and recently I spent a little bit of time in exchange with the fellers over at East Coast Avalanche Education, and thought it would be probably a good idea to take some of those ideas and make a video out of it. So let's talk about what kind of radio system I need for backcountry skiing. Specifically, this is kind of why I started this channel, so this is actually really where I want to go. But let's answer this question. What are your backcountry communication needs? And really, to answer that, you actually need to answer a few other questions. So let's look at this. Do you need to talk with your team or group at a distance, or individuals in your party spread out? Are they out of range of a shout or hand signals? And next, is your party or group spread out made up of more than one party? So this happens a lot in, say, yurt trips where there's a whole pile of people, like 8 people. It's good to be able to communicate between groups. And as part of your communication plan, do you want to be able to communicate out of the area and relay messages out into the real world, communicating that you're okay? Now, the first service I want to talk about is FRS, or Family Radio Service. Now, these frequencies don't require a license, but they are designated and controlled by the FCC. So they are a low power. They use what's called frequency modulation, or FM, in a narrow bandwidth, and that's how they stay legal as FRS. Now, communication potential varies between obstructions and line of sight. These work best with a direct line of sight, and therefore they work really well in small groups of people in the backcountry who are only separated by several hundred to maybe 1,000 feet. Given an exact line of sight, they can communicate several miles, but I wouldn't bank on that as a communication plan. Now, they also are going to be sharing frequencies with GMRS radios, which I'll get into in a bit. The common FRS radios are found everywhere. They're extremely available. Grocery stores, Home Depot, sporting goods shops, REI. The one that's most notable with backcountry skiers is done by BCA, or Backcountry Access. This is the Link 2.0 here, which I would recommend if you are looking at the Link series over the 1.0. The Link 2.0 is a far superior radio, and it is USB rechargeable, and it will give you a lot better range because it actually adapts to the new FCC rules, allowing for a 2-watt radio transmission. Now, this radio also has access to weather service, so you can monitor weather service in the mountains as well. Now, here is a typical situation in the backcountry where an FRS radio is going to do the job. Think about a team that is climbing to the top of the mountain and the other group sitting down below, in this case, the observation party, who's just watching with maybe binoculars, observing to make sure conditions are staying good for the climbing team, and also just to have some fun and watch their friends ski back down this couloir. In this case, the radios on the FRS platform are going to work great. So an example of when you need to be able to communicate with your party is this guy is skiing out of sight. He's going over a rollover. There's no way you're going to wave at him. Your voice isn't going to carry all the way down that hill, especially out there. So think about that. It's worthwhile to have something that allows you to communicate at a distance and out of sight. FRS and GMRS radio systems use frequencies 462 megahertz through 468 megahertz on specific channels designated by the FCC. It is part of the UHF band, and as a result, they can be very clear and transmit over long distances if you have a proper radio and antenna. The GMRS radio platform, or General Mobile Radio Service, allows you to buy a radio and switch out the antenna from factory, unlike the FRS radios. This gives you better range, better clarity, and in situations where you want to make sure you're communicating, GMRS is a lot better option than FRS. So this example with these distances, with these radios out in the field or on these mountainsides, is a good example of why a GMRS would probably be a better choice than FRS in that situation. So GMRS can also use higher power to transmit, up to about 5 watts on a handheld unit, and on certain frequencies or channels, up to 50 watts if you have a station that will do that, and that's usually a mobile or a home station that will do that. So the radios can vary in price, but they aren't terribly expensive at the base models from different manufacturers. So there is a license that's required, and you must use your call sign. But that's only every 10 minutes that you're conversing over the air. You should expect to hear people on the air as well who are using lesser radios. They will come through a bit less clear than your team if you're using GMRS radios. Amateur radio or ham radio is a little bit different. It uses different frequencies from FRS and GMRS, but it is common enough in the world outside of backcountry use or backcountry ski use. Ham radio requires you to attain a license through a process of education and learning and testing, and then you're registered with the FCC, much like with the GMRS license, but you know quite a bit more about radios at that point. So it is a good thing to have if you plan to use radios as a communication plan for your backcountry use or in emergency prep or whatever you're doing. Ham radio has the ability to connect over vast distances. And because there's so many people in the hobby, there's always people listening. So if it is part of your emergency plan to use a radio to communicate out for help, the ham radio is a much better option, but you should still rely on the ability to dial 911 if you can, or use a GPS beacon if it's possible. So ham radio offers better communication, clearer communication, and it's quite a bit more fun because the reception and the signal is so good. However, you're going to run into issues trying to find a backcountry ski partner who also has a ham radio license and radio equipment. What the ham radio experience will provide, though, is background and knowledge about radio and radio use. There's a certain etiquette for ham radio operators, and they all do their best to abide by it. In an emergency, these ham radio operators will respond and help you get the services or the emergency services you need, and even auto patch or do a phone patch to help you speak with emergency services through your radio if you need to. Ham radio also uses systems of repeaters that are set up by other ham radio operators that allow you to communicate over broad distances, and this is actually a great resource. I have talked in Utah with a handheld radio. I have talked to people in Idaho, in Las Vegas, and in Montana. So it is a pretty extensive network of repeaters that exists out there, and hopefully your area might have a repeater as well that enables better communication. Now let's look at this scenario. Now this actually happened. My ski partner and I were high in the mountains above a tiny little town in a remote part of Montana, and it was towards the end of the day, and you can see the sun is setting here, and we're unable to communicate back to cabin where we had someone waiting for us to arrive at the final hours of the day. We just didn't have a way to communicate with them. So there was actually a little bit of worry, a degree of concern, because we couldn't make that gap. Now, if you look here, this shows you kind of the situation and actual locations of where we were up on the mountain compared to where the cabin was. And in this scenario, the question for you is, how would you approach a communication solution? While nothing bad happened, it was still worth it to us to consider how we may have had a better communication plan in place for the next go around. Here's an argument for the FRS/GMRS radio services. Now, this includes Telluride, the Wasatch Front, and Snoqualmie Pass. Telluride has the oldest experience using FRS radios in the backcountry, and they have designated certain channels/frequencies and PL tones to go with those so that people can manipulate the tones to move away from the common use channels or common use banter on the radio, if you will. So these areas have done this in order to mitigate potential risks of skiers against skiers or skiers on skiers. In such a high use area, there's can be trouble with skiers above creating an avalanche that sends snow down onto skiers below. On top of general communication in the backcountry, when you have a high use area, it is wise to have a system in place where people can be made aware of what's going on in the area around them. And so that's why they've specified different channels for small pockets or small regions for each radio channel. Now, despite the fact that these radio initiatives have been instituted by your local avalanche center, if you're in one of these three areas, they are not monitors. These frequencies and channels are not monitored by law enforcement, by avalanche pros, by search and rescue or law enforcement. The only people monitoring these channels and their tones are other skiers, other backcountry skiers. So keep that in mind. Now, in order to prevent too much chatter on the air, if your team needs to communicate with itself, choose a different tone or a different channel and keep the group use or the common use channels open to communication between other parties. I want to make note that the channel, the FRS channel, is pretty obvious, but the PL or privacy line might not be as obvious. That refers to the tone that's instituted for the communication on that channel. I want to thank Tyler over at East Coast Avalanche Education for inspiring me to put this video together. It was chiefly his discussion with me that opened up this idea to create this video. Put a lot of effort into making this, and hopefully it is as clear as it can be. And if you have questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Meanwhile, go over to East Coast Avalanche Education and check out what they're doing. There's a link in the comments below. Thank you everybody for watching this video. As of this recording, I hit 1,000 subscribers on the channel, so that's pretty awesome. Thank you so much for all your support, and let's keep it going. See you down the trail. Backcountry Amateur Radio.